director of the USDA's Southern Plains Climate Hub in El Reno, Oklahoma. And I'd just like to welcome everybody this morning. We should have a really great opportunity for a really good talk today from Dr. Sam Fuhlendorf from Oklahoma State University. Sam is a professor in the Department of Resource Ecology and Management. Again, that's at Oklahoma State. And actually, I think I'll defer to Sam and let him give a bit of a description about what he does and what his research program is. And especially, I'll let him correct me if I got the pronunciation of his name wrong. So Sam, why don't I just turn it over to you and let you inform us this morning.
Okay, good morning and thank you. I'm glad to be here, and thanks for the invite and thanks for the introduction. As Kurt said, I'm Sam Fuhlendorf. I'm trained as a rangeland scientist and ecologist, and I've worked on a lot of different things related to conservation of rangelands, which in my definition are sort of grasslands, shrublands, savannas. Lots of times people are confused about the rangeland topic, but today I was going to talk about some of these in this first slide, these topics that are all over the internet and news sources about how rangelands fit into climate change and discussions that are ongoing that are related, that are largely controversial. And I was going to talk about all of them, but last week I attended the International Fire Ecology Conference, and so my brain is sort of focused on fire. So it seems like as this has developed, it's mostly focused on fire and woody plants, and specifically sort of the logic that's been bounced around a lot lately that maybe we could plant 1 trillion trees and cure climate change. And I'm actually not going to argue that that's a horrible idea, but I am going to talk about what that would mean. And so hopefully I can get that across. Let's see if I can. Okay, so for a little background information, one thing that we can talk about is, just what are these landscapes? How do they work? What do they provide? How have they operated in the past versus the future? And so if we look at grasslands, this is from a recent paper in Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. If we look at 1491 and before, grasslands largely operated, and of course this is a gross oversimplification, but we had wild herbivores, fire, and humans, and as well as other predators. And from the grassland perspective, there's obviously a lot of other things going on these landscapes. But this created a complex landscape that was critical for most of the things that lived there. And that's the way grasslands operated for the better part of 10,000 years across really complex multiple scales and so forth. Europeans came along and led to the current landscape, which is highly modified. We mostly replaced wild herbivores with domestic herbivores, and we have modern humans, for they're better or worse. We have replaced fire mostly with fossil fuels through petrochemicals and trucking and fences and etc. And so while that leads to a really complex landscape in one way, because we've introduced oil pads and crop fields and so forth, any of the remaining grasslands are actually much more simplified. And so the main point is that fire was the primary tool historically, and many of the systems are really highly adapted to fire. And it's been a part, and they're largely human managed fires. And so these landscapes were largely human dominated even 5,000 years ago. That was a very different culture and so forth. In fact, there's an awesome book by Richard Wrangham that makes the argument that actually cooking and sort of the controlling of fire was the primary thing that made humans human, and the developed ability to do that. So the fire, what I point out to is that these in conservation circles, often what we want to do is remove people, and that's very awkward at a minimum, and it may be absolutely foolhardy. In fact, if you look at grasslands, the landscapes that occurred in 1491 were largely influenced by humans and largely influenced by their fires primarily. And in fact, if you remove humans, you almost have to remove bison, and I don't want to go into this, but bison were really only dominant because humans the landscapes to be that way. Okay, so all of that said is background. What I really want to do today is talk about what if we limited fire and promoted trees. And, you know, obviously, part of what I'm going to say is that you can't really entirely limit fire, but if we attempted to do that, could we, and what would the world look like? What's the future hold if that's what we tried to do? And then finally, should fire be a part of climate change mitigation and adaptation? And I just want to say about the woody plant thing, this is not a new concept. In the early 1900s, a major goal was to plant forests all along the 100th meridian. So you can imagine that this kind of discussion is not all that new. But anyway, I hope to be able to address that. And part of it is I don't really want to argue that we need fires and even that we need grasslands. I mostly just want to talk about what would happen if we don't. And and there are some positive aspects. So for example, this is a study where they looked at fire suppression and total ecosystem carbon, and you definitely have more carbon when you suppress fires. This is complex because the question is, where is the carbon? In this case, you have, you know, almost 2 times the amount of total carbon. Now, most of that carbon is in panel A up in the top left. It's in above ground tree biomass. Notice the scales of all of these are different. The 2 dominant pools are the trees, and then C, the soils. So the soils aren't different. The trees are different. There's studies from all over the world about soils, whether there's more carbon in grasslands or when woody plants come into grasslands, and it's not really entirely resolved. There are some climate relationships and other things, but generally most of the change is above ground. That said, you do have an increase in carbon, and that is an ecosystem service in a world where carbon is a really serious issue. So I want to keep that on top of the table while we discuss other things that will change. So if we try and play future soothsayer and look at the future world, the first point I want to make is that we really don't have to use our imaginations very strongly because we've largely been suppressing fires and planting trees, as I mentioned, for the past 100 years. So it's not like we're just making these things up. There's a lot of data on what will happen. So it's just that it would only be more if we started doing it intentionally. And just as a note, this is MODIS data indicating the amount of fire. We've largely been fairly successful at suppressing fires. We've had a recent increase in wildfires that I'll talk about in a second, but if you compare biome types, in fact, I have a postdoc that's working on this. If you compare biome types in North America to those same climate vegetation systems in other continents like Africa, the amount of fire is substantially less in the US than it is in other systems. So we've obviously been able to suppress fire to some extent. Now, whether that contains a long term is another discussion. But there are some places that have a lot of fire. So for example, we can look at the Flint Hills in Kansas and Oklahoma, and we can actually zoom in on those. This is largely a fire-dominated landscape, and it's very shocking to people who haven't been there when they go and see how much fire there actually is. And in reality, this is one of the areas that actually has close to the same sort of fire that might have occurred historically. Most areas are quite different. But in general, North America is very fire prone. This is some excellent work by Rich Guyette and his group where they developed this map of potential fire systems that would occur based on historical fire patterns, but also on fuel chemistry and climate. And notice that those are up near 2 to 10 anyway in our region in terms of fire return intervals that would be expected. So we've greatly modified that, and we've already done that over the last 150 years. And in fact, just a couple of points here. TNC wrote this in land fires reports that 3/4 of U.S. lands dominated by native vegetation show moderate or high departure from reference conditions as a result of fire regime. So, you know, that brings up a lot of questions. Who cares about reference conditions? What do they really mean? Because we're in a new ball game with climate change, and that's a legitimate discussion. But I do think that as we talk about things changing in our landscapes, recognizing that one of the dominant things that have changed over the last several hundred years is a dramatic shift in the fire regime. And in fact, the NRCS has ecological site descriptions, and this is an analysis by a former postdoc that's now at Nebraska, Drac Twidwell, looking at what the dominant drivers in shift changes from, or state changes from one state to another were. And across the US, the dominant driver was the increase in woody plants or the removal of woody plants, primarily due to altered fire regimes. And that's strongly evident in the southern Great Plains, where it's in the blue category, which is 81 to 100% of the ecological sites in those regions. So this is based on expert opinion. So this woody plant thing is happening, and it's probably the dominant change that's occurring across the southern Great Plains now, but it's also occurring across the world. So one of the things that we have to talk about is what's been occurring and what happens when we have this increase in woody. And just for a little more background information on that, within our region, this is a recent paper by a postdoc, Reinhard Schultz. And Reinhard was able to use remotely sensed data and come up with a potential woody plant cover that can occur from the Rocky Mountains to across to Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas. And so basically, much of the plains can have substantial woody plants, even all the way over to the Rocky Mountains can support a substantial amount of trees and shrubs. And Drac Woodwell is quick to point out that this is based on what's there now.
Stay on haircut.
In reality, it could be greater, because those in order to have woody plants, they have to have gotten there So if there's seed limitations further out west, then perhaps it could even get higher. But nonetheless, we can have woody plants over much of the Great Plains. And as I mentioned, that's been happening. This is a study that shows how old I am because there's some papers from the previous century listed down there. And this was actually my PhD, which highlighted that the dominant vegetation change that's occurring across the landscape. We focused a lot on grazing historically, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in reality, what was happening was we were moving from left to right, and we crossed a fire threshold into this new state. And basically, we had a conversion of a landscape, sort of a biome switch that's occurring across the Great Plains now. So the way this generally works, if you think of multiple steady state models, is that you have a grassland, state A there. You get an encroachment of woody plants shown as B. But if a fire occurs, it can go back to A. But if it goes far enough and gets all the way to C, then the way we've traditionally viewed it is that that's really difficult, and we've actually called that a threshold. Reality is that we've actually learned lately it's not really a threshold, it's just maybe not a pretty transition that can happen. So, and one of the interesting things is that we might like the carbon balance in C, but do we like it in the bottom picture when a wildfire occurs, or even an extreme prescribed fire? So, and I actually don't know what the carbon conditions are in that bottom picture, and I actually would like to learn that. But if we have an increase in woody plants, which we are having, and if it continues, and even if we promote it, what ecosystem services will change along with that? I'm going to go kind of quick here. First one that gets talked about in agricultural circles is the decline in agricultural production. And we recently acquired a sustainability USDA grant where we argued the greatest threat to animal agriculture in the southern Great Plains is the increase in woody plants. So this is the Sonora Experiment Station from Texas A&M, and this is the number of animals supported on the A&M research station. And there's a lot going on here, and I'm going to just quickly highlight. At first, it was an animal science focus, and so we went from really heavily stocked to still heavily stocked during that time period. And they were mostly focused on animal diseases. They figured out in 1948 that most of the problems that are associated with how the land was managed and animals eating toxic plants, so the range people took over. The experts were here, and you can see they stabilized the system for a while, but then it continued to decline. And so, you know, you look at this, and we could make some Aggie jokes about sustainability that, you know, but I think it's pretty characteristic of the way the world was. Initially, they're focused on animal health. Then they're focused on grass production, and all the while, it's really going from a grassland to a woodland state. And so we had a 6-fold decline in livestock production during that time period. And you can go to Stillwater. Here's 2 pastures and the economic returns from livestock. And pasture 1 is between $10 and $20 a year. Pasture 2 started out up there, but gradually went near zero. And what happened is pasture 1 was burned frequently, and woody plants were kept to a minimum. And so that economic condition persisted. So main point, increase in woody plants has a major impact on livestock production. B, you don't like livestock production, maybe you like endangered species. Prairie chicken was petitioned in '95, listed in 2014. It's been delisted, but it's still a species of concern. Long story short, a lot of people focus on cultivated land as a primary driver of the decline in the species, which it probably was until about 1970. But since then, it's mostly been the increase in woody plants. And if you look at the historical distribution, the gold line, all the way down to near Mexico, and this species really cannot tolerate more than about a tree per acre, if even that. And so the primary factor is we've lost most of the prairies that occurred there to woodland encroachment. So the recent paper looks at intact landscapes to converted landscapes and tries to come up with a way that we can prioritize conservation for biodiversity. And the main point of this figure is somewhat obvious. As cultivated land and woodland goes up, obviously native prairie goes down, and the potential to actually manage local populations goes down as well. So that if you want to be able to have conservation practices by landowners, you really need to make sure, most importantly, that you stay on the left side of this figure. If you're on the right, it doesn't really matter what an individual landowner. So, if you don't like endangered species, maybe you like other wildlife, although this is grassland birds with eastern red cedar cover, and grassland birds are the most rapidly declining birds in the world. And so you got this major decline that occurs with the increase in woody plants, and it shouldn't be a surprise because they don't call them woody birds or tree birds, they call them grassland birds. Some of these are economically important, like bobwhite quail that people like to hunt. So if you don't like wildlife or livestock, maybe you like water. And water has been studied really well in Texas. I know studies really well done in Texas and Oklahoma, and I'm sure there's others that look at, does woody plant encroachment change the water cycle, and then also does it change the amount of water available in reservoirs and waterways? And the first answer is yes, it certainly changes the water cycle. And this graphic shows the amount of water storage in an area that has that's a grassland versus an area that's encroached. And basically, an encroached area has lower water availability, especially in the winter. But in terms of water available to society, it's a little bit of a debate. Brad Wilcox in Texas has shown several different approaches where killing woody plants doesn't provide increased stream flow. But Chris Zhao, at OSU, has done an equally well done job demonstrating that can indeed be the case. So that's sort of not just always the case that we'll all be bathing in fresh, clear water if we kill all the trees. It's actually still scientifically debated, and there's cases that it may work and cases that it wouldn't work. But nonetheless, it does alter the water cycle. So if you don't like water, then maybe you'd like to avoid being in a wildfire. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a second. But basically, so wildfires that occur, if the flame height is over 11 feet, then you can't battle fire from the ground. And basically, when you have cedar tree fire, which is like the one shown at Possum Kingdom, those are a good bit over 11 feet. Whereas a grass fire is, at least, you may actually have more fire in a grassland, but it's a lot less dangerous. And then there's some great work that obviously the fire world is dealing with really well, that we're going to have, in many places, we're going to have more fire. Some places we're going to have less fire. And it's sort of this balance between what limits the amount of fire. In some places it's biomass, fuel. In other places it's environmental conditions suitable for fire. So it gets more complex than we usually want to describe. Another effect of increased woody plants is human health, and I won't belabor this other than saying I hate cedar pollen, and so do a lot of other people apparently. And there's good data from Estelle Levitin that shows the increase in cedar pollen over time, and it's continued. And people have analyzed how much of an economic impact that is. But there's a couple of other human health issues. As eastern red cedar has moved from the east out into the prairies, it's brought with them species of disease vectors that are also influencing the people in those landscapes. And there's several studies that have, these are by people at OSU, but there's others that have looked at the spread of disease vectors as these biomes have shifted. Okay, so I shrunk number 2, which I talked too much about, and now I'm on number 3, which is one thing that we would expect is increased wildfires. And I highlight here, you know, are wildfires increasing, and are they partially caused by fire suppression, and are they partially caused by the increase in woody plants? And it's hard to separate all of that out because they're also caused by climate change. The general point is that actually the numbers of fires across the U.S., total number of fires haven't increased, but the numbers of acres burned have increased, and the numbers of fires in the Great Plains have increased, as well as the number of acres. This is a great paper by colleagues, Greg Twidwell, Carissa Wonka, and Victoria Donovan in Nebraska, where they've highlighted this increase in wildfire. And lots of people have associated this with climate change, but it also can be associated with fuels. And this is a study where we were looking at, could we manage wildland fuels using fire and grazing? And the main point here is that you can, but really fire alone, just the rate of spread of the fire months since you do a prescribed fire, and you see that with fire only, you get real, in grasslands, fuel recovers really quickly. So, and in fact, you only keep fuel limited for about 6 months, whereas in where you have fire and it interacting with grazing, you actually can extend that out to 30 months. So fire alone may not matter as much, but fire and grazing certainly can modify the fuel load. So we can use fire along with other things to manage fuel, wildfire danger, but that doesn't change the fact that climate change is still having a major impact. So another important aspect of grasslands is biodiversity effects, not associated with the increase in woody plants, but instead associated with the way we use fire on those landscapes. And I've done a lot of research on this, pyrrhic herbivory, which is basically sort of using the fire grazing interaction as in the previous example to manage fuels, but in this case to create heterogeneity of biomass across the landscape that is critical for the way these landscapes operate. And I'm just going to be brief here, but basically the point is that you have these vegetation states that are variable with time since fire and grazing. And animals can select from anywhere on these landscapes they want. So the patch on the left that's been recently burned has a high probability of grazing. And since there's almost no fuel there and the grazing limits the amount of fuel, there's a low probability of fire. And then that switches to the opposite on the right. And then if we take that variable structure that's driven by fire and grazing, and we ask how does that change biodiversity, look at breeding birds. So the way these line up, so killdeer and larkspur require it's 1 to 12, and Henslow greater than 36. And if you want to have all of these breeding birds, you have to have all of these states across the landscape, including recently burned in. We've also looked at winter birds and found similar things. We looked at small mammals. We looked at greater prairie chickens, which actually require multiple hatch types. And then we've even looked at nitrogen availability, endangered butterflies, invertebrates, and water infiltration. So, in addition, it actually can increase livestock production. So it's a potential benefit there. But I do want to take this opportunity just to highlight that not only are the plants in our landscapes adapted to fire, but they're also our animals. This is a paper from Torrey Hobick where we coined the term pyrite carnivory. And we looked at raptors before, during, and after a fire. And just to give you a taste, I'll show you a piece of this video, which is pretty dramatic. This is a summer fire here in Stillwater. Oops, maybe I won't show you.
This is insane.
So basically, when we light a fire, these raptors come in from all around and use these for hunting. And the numbers can go from near 0 to nearly 100 raptors in the air. So, and that, you know, you can't give a talk about fire without referencing this paper, which argues that there are birds that spread fire, that actually are pyromaniac birds or something. This is kind of a debated topic. People like the thought of birds actually contributing to the spread of fires, but I'm not sure that we could argue how important that actually is. But nonetheless, there are other examples. This is a picture from David Augustine, a burned up prickly pear pad, but it's not all prickly pear. This is a mountain plover, which is an endangered species, a mountain plover chick that blooms in really well. Just to sort of suggest that these animals have perhaps seen fire in their genetic background. Okay, so all of that's changing, but are there other alternatives? Can we keep grasslands and maybe eliminate fire? And I just will highlight there are alternatives. And one that we're studying more now are using browsers, like in the one picture there. But most of the others are largely petrochemical based. And this is just a paper by a former student and current colleague, Brady Allred, looking at the ecosystem services lost as we increase oil and gas, and specifically in the Great Plains, sort of a broad, at least the central part of the US. And the point is that we've lost a whole lot of carbon just to energy development. So not only are we capturing more energy, but we're actually losing production. And in fact, the estimates that of the amount of ag production that have been lost from the increased energy development activity in these zones are breathtaking. You know, they rival things like livestock production is approaching the amount of production we get off of all the western public rangelands. So, so we're having, not only is energy development having an impact by we're capturing more carbon that we're using, it's also having an impact at lowering the amount of carbon that we're actually capturing. So we've lost, in that area, we've lost what, 3 million hectares of land area that energy development had 12 teragrams per year production. So I don't know, those numbers are are big. But the other, a major final point I want to make is these are still largely socio-ecological landscapes, and this is important. So the Native Americans were, but this comes down to a challenge that I mostly study this green box over here, but most of what's done on that land is driven by all these other boxes, and it's actually a really complex discussion about why somebody does something that they do on their landscape. And so one of the things that we've been working on with Brad Wilcox is how do we approach this more like a socio-ecological system? And we're making progress. And the example is that if you want a grassland, you can look at A here, and you can have an ecological gradient that has a grassland from, and you can have anywhere along this. If you're in state 2, then you're in a condition that favors a grassland. But you also have to have the social gradient that promotes woody plant management. So if you're in 2, then that means you have no social background that promotes the continued maintenance of this grassland. And then in reality, in order to have a grassland, you really have to have the conditions set out in 4, which is environmental conditions that favor a grassland, but also the social and cultural aspects that favor a grassland. Okay, so what if we limit fire and promote trees? What would the future look like? Should fire be part of climate change mitigation and adaptation? It's actually about complex trade-offs, and I don't think any one person has the answer, but I think just planting trees, as they said in the Guardian article, or even the scientific paper that it references, it acts like there's nothing happening on those landscapes of any value, and there's a lot of trade-offs. And the problem is there's no planning or consistency to policy as well as management. I mean, there's programs that promote things like tree planting, but there's also programs that promote killing trees. And I think that's a great frustration to the public. And we wonder sometimes why they don't believe in climate change. And I think some of that may be the fact that they're kind of getting mixed messages. I am an ecologist that learned about social science, and I feel like it's revolutionary, but there's a lot of social scientists that just think I was foolish all along, and they're probably correct. But this is mostly private land, and without understanding the people as part of the system, I don't think we understand much. And then finally, there are a lot of important, even some of them ecological, but many of them are policy related, like how important is above ground carbon versus below ground? If we sequester it, do we want to get it below ground? Should we consider different strategies for different types of land? So can we promote woody plants on abandoned cropland that has low carbon, but maybe the true prairie, we limit it? And then finally, this whole idea of conservation triage. I just think that the conservation community needs to develop a better organization in their message so that we're not putting prairie chicken conservationists against climate change conservation. Because I think conservation really isn't a major part of the global language right now, so it's not good to have groups that are against each other. And then finally, a little more philosophical, I talk to my students a lot about, have we moved from this Aldo Leopold world into the world of George Jetson? And so I was trained that, and there's some good books that are written on this. One is The Wizard and the Prophet by Charles Mann, but I was sort of brought up in the conservation world where we needed ecosystems and we needed to operate the way they're supposed to operate, which is the Aldo Leopold world. And sometimes I feel like we've moved into the George Jetson world where we're planning on living separate from the ecosystems, and maybe we aren't as dependent upon them as we used to think. So I don't know if that's true, but I'll just leave you with that